Hello, I'm Richard Claus with Student Engagement Staff of GCC. Continue to work through our Philosophy 101 class, sort of our reading group together. You'll notice I'm outside today. The lighting is great. We've got some nice weather. And I was tired of being inside, so hopefully that'll work today. Hopefully the sound will be okay. I just was interrupted by the pest control guys. Hopefully this video will go a little better. We're on page 493 of the 4th edition. For those of you who have the 5th edition of your book, we're on page 462. And I just want to remind you what we're doing here. Hopefully you've attempted to try to do the readings. And then if you've done that, these videos are sort of help you with sort of what are the key pieces in those readings that are really you should be pulling out for your purposes, for your education, as well as, you know, any quizzes or tests. And so that's my job, sort of to help along with the readings themselves, to pull out some of the key ideas. Hopefully you've been watching some of the other videos we put on there, like sort of the Crash Course Philosophy. So you're going to get some of the main concepts. If you've watched those, even before this video, you'll have gotten some of the key concepts, and we're going to discover those concepts as well in our reading, and you'll get a chance to actually read Kant's words for yourself. So we're moving from utilitarianism, that we talked about with Bentham and Mill the last few videos, and now we're moving into what is called deontological ethics. Deontological has to do with duty. So if you think of in terms of deontological and the other D word, duty, you'll be doing great. That's where we want you to be. So deontological ethical theory says it is the principle of duty that determines the moral value of actions. And so the deontologist is not interested necessarily in the consequences. That's utilitarianism. That's somebody different. They're looking at what's the principle of duty that's going to determine the moral action, and how do we engage in actually accomplishing doing that duty. The major philosopher associated with deontological ethics is Immanuel Kant. Just so you're aware, we've looked at Bentham and Mill. We're actually going back in history before them to look at Kant. And so utilitarianism we looked at first, but historically Kant comes before them, just so you're aware of that. Kant is a major figure in the history of philosophy. William Barrett in your textbook in the middle there, 493, says, Kant can justly be called the father of modern philosophy, for out of him stem nearly all the still current and contending schools of philosophy. He's an amazing philosopher. When I took my very first philosophy class at GCC over 30 years ago, the professor was talking about Aristotle and Plato, and I had heard of those. They're sort of in our culture. Those are smart guys. And yet then he said, Immanuel Kant deserves to be placed in the same sentence with Plato and Aristotle. He is that influential. His thought is that important. And I had never even heard of him, so perhaps some of you haven't. But he is that influential in the history of philosophy for a number of areas of philosophy, and today we're looking at his ethics. I will say this, Kant is difficult to read. And so this may be some of the more difficult readings you'll have in the textbook. And so use the videos we've mentioned before, use this video. I'm going to try to point out, what the concepts are, but I do want us to see it in Kant's own words. So that's our goal with our reading time today. All right, let's get into our reading. For Kant, looking at ethics, he wants to base it on reason, not feelings or impulses, because feelings and impulses can change from person to person. But if we could find some basis in reason that would ground our ethics, then we would have a commonality between all people that are willing to use their reason. On page 494, our author, Chaffee, uses this language you can see in the very center there on 494 in the boldface, a priori. A priori. And this simply means prior to experience or based on pure reason without the need for empirical verification. So you can see that listed there. So you want to know, what can reason tell me without having to look at the world itself, without having to look at consequences or anything else? What does reason tell me about ethics? Perhaps you're familiar with that word a priori. Perhaps it came up in your philosophy of religion. Some of the arguments for God's existence are a priori, namely the ontological argument. It's an argument based solely on reason itself, whereas the other arguments in that section were based on evidence, or looking at the world, our senses, some sort of empirical verification. So the opposite of a priori is a posteriori, which means based on senses. And so, but Kant wants to have it based a priori, without the need to look at anything in the world itself, but simply based upon reason itself. So be aware of that philosophical vocabulary. A priori might show up in your readings. Obviously shows up in your readings, but also maybe some tests and quizzes. On the bottom of page 494, there's two pieces to developing a moral person according to what Kant is going to argue, and our author summarizes it this way, I think helpfully. The first part is to develop a clear understanding of the necessary and universal moral laws that apply to all people in all circumstances. So the first thing we're looking at, what are the moral laws? What are the individual laws that we're supposed to live by, that everybody everywhere is supposed to live by? So that's the key first thing. What are the moral laws? The second thing is to develop the goodwill to actually follow these laws. So now that we find the laws, what about how do we have a goodwill that we might use to actually follow these laws that we discover by reason? So the two key pieces here, we use reason to discover which moral laws there are, and then we develop a goodwill to actually follow these laws. And so reason and goodwill, you'll notice that, are key terms and concepts. And the goodwill is to be directed itself by reason. You'll notice key reading in our text today is on page 495 in the 4th edition. It's in the green box. Look at the first paragraph, the first two sentences. These are key sentences. They're longer sentences, but he says, "Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification, except a good will. Intelligence, wit, judgment, and the other talents of the mind, however they may be named, or courage, resolution, perseverance, as qualities of temperament, are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects, but these gifts of nature may also become extremely bad and mischievous if the will which is to make use of them, and which therefore constitutes what is called character, is not good." What he's saying there, the will is the key piece. Because you can have other values, other virtues, like maybe he mentions intelligence or courage. But you can have an intelligent person and they do morally reprehensible things. You might have somebody who's very courageous in doing evil things and going out and murdering people. And he says, so even though that's a virtue, it's not the good in itself. Only the will itself can be called good if we're actually engaging that will with the use of our reason to pursue the moral law or our moral duties. So that's the key piece. The will itself, not any consequences that flow from that, not anything else. Look at the last paragraph now in that section on 495. Kant writes, "A good will is good not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition, by the virtue of the willing itself. That is, it is good in itself and considered by itself to be esteemed much higher than all that can be brought about by any favor of any inclination, nay, even of the sum total of the inclinations. Even if it should happen that owing to special disfavor or fortune, or the niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature, this will should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose." So even if for whatever reason, you can't even accomplish what your will wants to accomplish, but you're still trying, that's what he's getting at with that section. He goes on, "If with its greatest effort it should yet achieve nothing, and there should remain only the good will, not to be sure a mere wish, but the summoning of all the means in our power, then like a jewel, it would still shine by its own light as a thing which has a whole value in itself." That phrase, even if it achieves nothing, the very fact that you attempted, that you willed, and so we're sort of getting here at the motives. Did you try to engage in the duty? Kant's not worried about whether you actually did the duty, what the consequences that flow from that action are, but the very fact that you had a good will to follow the moral law, and you attempted, and if for whatever reason you were thwarted, let's say you attempted to help somebody, you were going to help the proverbial old woman across the street, you're going to do this good deed to this person, and so you willed to do this for the sake of willing good, but for whatever reason your car door wouldn't open. You still did something good because you willed the good, you wanted to do the good. This sort of brings up the topic of motive. And this is what one author said about Kant, another philosopher. He says, this brings us to the role of motives. Kant moves ethical evaluation to the beginning of the process, instead of putting it at the end as utilitarianism does. Rather than relying on results or the consequences to tell us whether we have done the right thing, we look at the motives. Did you desire, were you activating your will for the good, for the sake of the good? On page 496, our reading takes us to the very first sentence in that green box, just the first sentence. "The will is a faculty to choose that only which reason independent of inclination recognizes as practically necessary, that is, as good." As a matter of fact, our author then goes on in the middle of that, on that middle of that page. He says the bottom line, you can see listed there, the bottom line is that though the good will is the mainspring of moral goodness, It is a force that needs to be directed by reason. It is the human ability to reason and reflect that makes possible the creation of moral ideals that we can then will into existence through the choices we make. These moral ideals then function as commands, or he's going to use the phrase or the word imperatives. And so human reason creates the moral ideals, these imperatives that we're supposed to live by and we're supposed to recognize. And so these imperatives, as our reading goes on to talk about, come in two kinds. This is Kant's phraseology: hypothetical and categorical. Hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. You want to know that. Philosophers love distinctions. Kant is a philosopher. He loves to make these distinctions. And so hypothetical versus categorical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative, if you've read, you'll recognize it's a moral law that is a means to something else. When somebody says, you ought to do this. So if I'm driving and somebody in my car says, hey, you should slow down, or you ought to slow down, because I'm going over the speed limit. You ought to slow down because the police are right behind us. This is a hypothetical imperative because, hey, it's something I ought to do if I want to avoid getting a ticket. I'm doing it for the sake of something else. I'm not doing it simply because it's good in itself. I'm doing it because I want something else. Namely, I don't want a ticket. I want to just, be free of that hassle. And so that would be a hypothetical imperative. On page 497, you can see how Kant talks about it. He says, now all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. That's the first sentence in our green box. And now in the center, in the second paragraph, the last sentence, if now the action is good only as a means to something else, then the imperative is hypothetical. If it is conceived as good in itself, and consequently as being necessarily a principle of a will which of itself conforms to reason, then it is categorical. And again, our author is helpful at the bottom of that page. He talks about hypothetical imperatives have sort of an if-then quality to it. If you want to be morally just, then you should strive to remove your personal feelings from your judgments. If you want to be charitable, then you should help those less fortunate than you. And the idea here is that you're doing certain things, but for the sake of something else. The categorical imperative is the key concept, though, and that's Kant's big sort of present to ethics, what his big sort of discovery about ethics. And the categorical imperative is a maxim or a moral law that is morally good in and of itself. It's not a means to something else. It simply by itself is good. So the question becomes, well, that's great. How do we discover what is a categorical imperative? How do we find them by reason? How does reason discover the categorical imperative, those moral laws that are good in and of themselves? And on page 498, there's a key discussion here that's helpful. Look at the first paragraph in the green section there. Finally, there is an imperative which commands a certain conduct immediately without having as its condition any other purpose to be attained by it. This imperative is categorical. It concerns not the matter of the action or its intended result, not consequentialism, but its form and the principle of which it is itself a result. And what is essentially good in it consists in the mental disposition, let the consequences be what they may. Forget what consequences are flow from it, but simply the form of it should tell us something. Now the third and fourth paragraphs in that same section, the third paragraph is simply one sentence long. This is a key one you want to mark in your textbook. There is therefore but one categorical imperative, namely this: act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. The very next paragraph he goes on. Since the universality of the law according to which its effects are produced constitutes what is properly called nature in the most general sense as to form, that is, the existence of things so far as it is determined by natural laws, the imperative of duty may be expressed thus. And he sort of words it just slightly different. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. So that is the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. Now the fact that I'm calling it the first formulation means there's others, right? There's going to be a second and third actually in Kant. Our textbook's only going to talk about two. So this is the first one. We're going to talk about a second categorical imperative or a second formulation of it later. But what I want to see right now is that for the first formulation, I'm supposed to, any maxim that I have, I'm working with, I should be able to universalize, to say, all of a sudden, what if I were to will that this were to become the maxim or the moral law that everybody everywhere had to live by in this moment? And so what Kant's saying is that if you can universalize the maxim without contradiction, then we have found a categorical imperative. So it's a unique thing. Sometimes this is called the principle of universal sizability. Can you universalize this to everybody for all times in all places? I want to stop there. If you've understood the concepts of reason, goodwill, with reason having an a priori function to it, and these ideas of hypothetical and categorical imperatives, and the categorical imperative, at least in this first formulation, is something you can universalize, then you're doing well. That's some of the stuff that you should be finding in the readings, as well as the videos we've been posting online to watch as well. So next time we'll pick up here with Kant's first version of the categorical imperative. We're going to see some examples he uses to try to flesh it out, and then we'll move on to also his second formulation of the categorical imperative. All right, thank you very much.